Welcome to the English Heritage Podcast. I'm Amy Matthews. Today we have the first in a special series all about our coastline. We'll be looking at the part it's played in our history, from Henry VIII's fortifications to Victorian travellers. And in another first, you'll be able to watch these episodes as well as hear them. So, if you're not looking at us already, go and find the video on Spotify or the English Heritage YouTube channel. You can check out what we look like, as well as being able to see some of the objects that we talk about. Today, we're focusing specifically on our coastline during Roman times. With me in the studio today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Andrew Roberts and Dr. Kathryn Bedford, the dream team as far as I'm concerned when it comes to all things Roman. It's so lovely to have you both. How are we today?
I'm doing great, thank you very much.
Good. How about yourself, Kathryn?
Good, thank you.
Fabulous. It's so nice to have you both. Now, obviously, our coastlines have changed dramatically since Roman times. However, there are still some features that connect us to this period that remain. So what are some of the physical features of the coastline that connect us to this time?
Well, primarily, we have a suite of Roman fortifications around the southeast and the south of England. Those include Porchester, Pevensey, Burr, Caister and Reculver. But the star of the show is a place called Richborough, which is near Dover in Kent. And Richborough is really kind of typifies the various different topics that we're going to consider when we consider the Roman coast, because the Romans come there during the invasion of Britain. It's a port and a town from the very first stages of Roman Britain right up until the very end. And its fortunes rest upon the sea.
So we are starting our conversation today around an object, as usual. But our object this week is not the first time we've had seafood in the studio. We have got a tray of oysters. They're very beautiful. It's like having a little rock pool in the studio. And I mean, I don't yet know how these link to our topic today. So would either of you like to enlighten me as to how we get to a point where we've got oysters in the studio to start talking about Roman coasts?
Well, they are, to an extent, a little taste and a smell
yes.
of Roman Britain. And more specifically, when we think about Richborough, we know that in around AD 80, so about 50 or so years into the conquest of Roman Britain, there is a courtier called Montanus who is at the court of the Emperor Domitian. And it was said by the poet Juvenal that he could discern the difference between oysters that had been farmed on the Bay of Naples at a place called Baiae and those that had been farmed on the Rutupian shore.
Okay.
And Rutupiae is the Roman name for Richborough. But I think more intriguingly, I think the way that the word Rutupiae is being used here implies that it is standing in for Britain as a whole, almost like saying that Britain is Dover.
I see.
Or London. And so perhaps what it means is that any kind of oysters imported for Britain are from Rutupiae. And that's quite significant because it says that in the Roman mind, this port town of Rutupiae is so significant. It's been heard, it's known throughout the Roman Empire. And the reason for that, I think, is because this is where the invasion of Britain begins. And it's also the official entranceway to Roman Britain and one of the most connected places in the Roman world.
Okay, so it's representing Britain as a whole.
Yeah. Okay,
so in sort of on that subject then, could you tell me a little bit more about how Richborough, as she's now known, what's its role within Roman Britain's global connections?
Oyster shells, actually, as someone who deals with archaeology, are very common objects in archaeological depositions. And we know that the eating of oysters was something that is going on throughout Roman Britain. And actually in one of our other coastal sites down at Pevensey, there is in the collection a special fork designed for eating shellfish like oysters. So the oysters feed into that sort of broader concept of the place of Britain within the Roman Empire, but also take us into the personal lives of people in Britain as well.
I see. So they're not necessarily shooting them back in the way that we envisage now.
No, this idea of oysters as being this elite food is a very modern concept. I know I said they're in the court of the emperor, but they're going to be for everyday consumption as well.
Oh, fantastic. And as you say, this idea of them as a sort of bougie food is relatively modern, isn't it? It would have been, far more normal just to be eating these every day. So could you tell me more about Richborough and its role in Roman Britain's global connections?
Yeah, so Richborough, it is actually today is landlocked. Okay, so we're talking about its coastal connections. If you turned up there, you'd think that I was kind of just messing with you, to be honest, because it's about 2.5 miles from the sea. But in the Roman period, it actually sits on a promontory that juts out into a body of water, a channel known as which we call the Wansum Channel. And in the Roman period, this divides mainland Kent from the island of Thanet. And it's a really important location because it effectively acts as a protected anchorage. And the location is really important for the same reasons that Dover is still a very busy port to this day. It's a short hop across the channel from what is northern France, but was Gaul, the province of Gaul in the Roman times.
And I mean, most famously, it is believed to be a major, if not the landing point for the Claudian invasion as well.
I see.
So,
and when was this?
So that is 43 AD. This is the moment at which Romans invade Britain. They're coming via Richborough.
The Roman fleet sails across from northern Gaul, very quickly establishes itself without resistance in this locality. But then they build a fortification for which we have very good evidence on site. Indeed, recently we reconstructed a portion of that fortification that was used to protect the anchorage there, and then moved inland essentially towards where modern day London is and north towards Colchester.
So could you now tell me a little bit more about the wider Roman coastline of Britain? So how connected were the other ports and locations?
Well, Britain has at this point become part of a much broader European-wide, really, empire of Rome. And as such, the English Channel isn't a dividing line. It is the point of communication. It is a major route. The shipping lines are the equivalent of the Roman roads when we're thinking about it. So a short hop over the channel is the equivalent, and actually for many of the Romans, easier than a similar distance over land.
So Monty Python has a lot to answer for him. Because if I was to say to you, how did the Romans get around? What is their legacy? Everyone's going to go, well, they built the roads and they're really straight and they go from point to point. Yeah, fine. But the Roman roads are only sort of the smallest part of your journey if you're going a long way. This is the first part and the last part. If you want to go long distances, if you want to send your soldiers long distances, if you want to trade over long distances, then it's about the water and it's about shipping. But then also to get these places, these people and goods to places where they're needed, you're going to have to incorporate rivers. So one of the major ports of Roman Britain is actually London.
Of course.
So you can sail down the Thames up to a point where you're going to hit the original London Bridge.
So these were points where it's not just oysters that, when as much as that was our starting point. These are, it's trade flowing in and out. It's people, it's ideas, it's new technology, I'm guessing.
So many of those things.
Yeah.
And I mean, the difficulty is going to be working out when to stop talking about the things that came in. But yeah, in terms of trade and specific objects coming into the country, glass is a big one. In the Roman world, basically all raw glass was made in the area. It's now Syria and Egypt. Everywhere else, raw glass was exported to and then made by local craftsmen. Really high status objects might be made and transported in trade, but glass as a material was something that was coming in to Britain to be being used, because literally it was not made here at all. We've got, Richborough is an incredible collection. I have got 450 brooches from this site. I've got over 1,000 hairpins. The numbers of objects from Richborough are fantastic, which means that I can sort of talk about this kind of stuff in quite a lot of detail. The soldiers themselves, obviously, are coming into the country, and with them come, to an extent, particularly early on, some of the craftsmen associated with the things that they need. So they're bringing equipment, they're also bringing new kinds of food which require new kinds of preparation devices. So mortaria, which is a particular large flat bowl, they're very heavy, they're very thick-rimmed, and they're coarse because they're used a bit like a mortar and pestle. You're sort of grinding things in them. So originally you see the army bringing their own ones, and then you see local craftsmen learning how to make them.
So they're bringing with them not just new food and new equipment, but their culture as well, and new skill sets.
Absolutely, and new design ideas. The hairpins that I mentioned earlier, hairpins again weren't something that were used by pre-Roman British women. They're an introduction of the Romans.
So we're seeing a fusion of cultures and ideas. And I guess on that note as well, obviously with people come their own ideas and backgrounds and beliefs. So Andrew, what else?
Well, it's really useful just to kind of emphasise what Kathryn's said there, which is that this is not just a military invasion. This is a cultural invasion, and there's a lot of kind of nuance that comes out of that, because the Brits also kind of push back against that to a certain degree, and they rework that in their own style. The garrison of Britain, which is one of the largest military garrisons in the Roman Empire, is made up of peoples drawn from across the 3 continents of the Roman Empire. So the Romans had a tendency, when they conquered new places, to recruit, let's say, the soldiers from that particular area, and then break the connection between the soldiers and their particular land. So they would raise a regiment, let's say, in somewhere like Dacia, which is more or less modern Romania, and they did so during Trajan's wars in around about AD 100. And then they'd send that regiment elsewhere. And so there are regiments of Dacians, for example, that end up in Britain. And when Hadrian's Wall is built in around AD 122, they go and occupy one of the forts along Hadrian's Wall, now some 20 years and thousands of miles away from their home. So it's possibly often quite surprising to people how much mobility there was
in
the ancient world.
And we think about globalization as a relatively modern phenomenon, but really there's iterations of it throughout all of history, obviously.
There are a number of instances within the Richborough collection, specifically with the equipment used in trade, so weighing equipment, where you can say that this object has come from there. And the one that is the furthest is there's a small weight, it's a little bit larger than a marble, it's round with sort of a flat bottom and top, and it's come all the way from Byzantium, so that's Constantinople, Istanbul. And when you've got a lot of objects and you put on a map where they've come from, you can kind of go, if all of the ones, they're pretty much all over here, and then there's one over there, that tells you that one was a personal possession of a person who has moved.
Yes.
So we can see that this is a person who has moved from Byzantium to Richborough. It's not that this is a weight made there that is in use generally and has gone there.
When the Romans turn up in Britain, they bring with them their traditional rituals and the ways that they worship their particular gods. I think what's apparent, however, is that the way in which polytheistic religion works means that the Romans aren't necessarily exclusively wedded to those gods. They may think that those gods are particularly powerful, but there is room for more to be added. They believe that different gods inhabited different places and were powerful wherever they were in the world.
And they have aspects as well, so it can be the local aspect of Jupiter.
Yeah. So, for example, you may find a god that's worshipped by the place that you're encountering, say on Hadrian's Wall, that is looks a little bit like the war god Mars, for example, but the locals call it, let's say, I'm trying to think about I've got the Veteres, for example. The Veteres, I think, is worshipped on Hadrian's Wall, and it looks a little bit like Mars, and that's great because we know what Mars is like, and they look a little bit like our gods, and we can worship that one, and the locals can also worship that god at the same time, and everyone's reasonably happy. But then the other thing that stems from having such an interconnected empire is that you get waves of development in these kind of ideas. So later on in the period of Rome in Britain, you get the introduction of a new god called Mithras, who in origin comes from Persia. So it's kind of outside of the Roman world and spreads via the institution of the army particularly. And we end up with that god being worshipped as far north as Hadrian's Wall, at a place called Carabra, for example, which is a free site within the English Heritage Collection.
You get a similar thing with Isis, who is an Egyptian god who shows up throughout the Roman Empire.
Also sort of start to be, reimagined here. So we've got this influx of new equipment and new objects and new cuisines that are being adopted and given a new... it's fusion, isn't it? A fusion of ideas based on them being in a new location. And that is being reflected in belief systems as well. So whether it's, pots or gods, they're being sort of taken on, absorbed and slightly altered.
Yeah, given their own local flavour. And it goes both ways.
Yeah.
There's things going from Britain back out. We've already mentioned the oysters, but metals, silver and tin in particular, are going the other way. Whitby jet is being exported as well. So
so gorgeous.
The connections are going in both directions.
Britain also was famous for exporting rebellion quite a bit. There are numerous examples of prominent generals who build up a power base in Britain and then go off to try and conquer the Roman Empire.
So we exported oysters and chaos. Beautiful.
Yes.
So let's hear a little bit more about Richborough. So what can we imagine of this shoreline? What would the living, working life there have looked like? Let's immerse ourselves. Let's do a bit of time travel.
Well,
pick your date at Richborough.
So we say roughly
early Roman Britain.
Well, not too early, because to begin with, it's a military site. But if we want to kind of get to the kind of the golden age of Richborough, maybe we'll cite that in, say, about AD 150, let's say, for argument's sake. And at this point, you would see Richborough long before you arrived.
Oh.
Because at Richborough, there was a gigantic monumental arch that overlooked the coastline, but it was 25 metres high.
Okay.
25 metres high.
For context, that's a modern 13-storey building.
Yeah. And probably the largest arch in the entire Roman Empire, as far as we know. And it's not at Rome. It's at Richborough. Anecdotally, we think that it may well have been visible, certainly way, way, way out in the Channel, maybe all the way across to the French coast.
At least halfway through Kent, there are places that you would still be able to see the top of it. And the vast majority of the way across the Channel, depending on your angle.
And what would the pressures have been like on the coast throughout the Roman period, and how did they change and evolve?
In the early period, obviously, there's a lot of military focus along the coastal sites. You're going to see the military really dominate these places and setting up supply lines, essentially. You're going to get the constant turnover and influx of, say, new soldiers being sent to the province, new traders, officials turning up, Roman officials. The one thing we do know about Richborough, where you can say positively certain people were there, is that at various times, important Roman travellers come through Richborough on the way to somewhere else if they're going to the provincial capital at Londinium. Then to come back to how this evolves, is that there's a very definite change in the last century and a half or so of Roman Britain in terms of attitude towards the coast. So from, let's say broadly, about 250 onwards. And so if you went to Richborough in this period, you're not going to see you're not going to see the arch, unfortunately. But from about 270-ish, the arch has disappeared. You're actually going to see the imposing walls of a fort. They demolished the centre of the city in order to build this fort, maybe as strongholds for the import, the export of grain or other stuffs. Or probably more likely, they're built at a time when Britain has become semi-independent from the rest of the Roman Empire.
There's also the fact that whilst we're talking about the ones that are on the British coast, a smaller set of the same kinds of things were being built on the other side of the Channel as well. So there are these defensive structures which are appearing on both sides of that line, not just one.
It's a two-way.
It's a very, very complex thing working out what on earth is going on, because they're not all being built at the same time. There are similarities of design, but not always. At Richborough, we've got this double fort where there's one built and then about 50 years later they build another one. And no one has really figured out what they're doing.
Oh, but this is the bit of history that we love, where we've got enough. There's a tantalising / frustrating amount of information we do have, and lots of lovely, delicious gaps for us to investigate. And I have to, speaking of, actually, do we know what happened to the big arch?
So the big arch, you can actually see the big arch on
Not
site.
its official name,
in a sense, because it survives the first iteration of fort building, but then by the time they built the second fort, which is more in evidence on the site, it is demolished to the ground. And the way that you can spot it is that its cladding, which is this stunning, very expensive Carrara marble.
Oh, wow.
Is ground up and used as mortar for this fortification.
Some of my bits that I've got in store have been scored and used as gaming boards. So they've been turned into a functional object later on for use in the fort by soldiers in the community there.
And just for context, Carrara marble is the same marble used for Marble Arch in London.
Were there particular areas that were more resistant or slower on the uptake to these European influences than others? And is there a reason for that? Yeah,
so one of the potential premises for the Roman intervention in the first place by Claudius is that the relationships that have been formed many decades previously after Caesar turns up for a brief period, and then there are certain Iron Age aristocrats, kings, who have personal relationship with the Roman Empire, and actually that the resistance that occurs is actually quite quickly destroyed.
Where you have the very high profile resistance, like Boudica, for example, there's often personal reasons why they're doing that, as well as potentially economic ones.
Famously, of course, Hadrian's Wall kind of all but caps off the northern end of the province. It's not the exact limit of Roman power, but it's sort of this hard barrier at the north of the province.
It's a very neat way of looking at things.
It's a very neat way of looking at it, but it's not that neat because actually there's a lot of military infrastructure both to the north and particularly to the south in depth, and the connection to the coast is really important. So Hadrian's Wall itself has a string of forts across the backbone of the country between essentially modern-day Newcastle and just to the west of Carlisle at a place called Burr by Sands. That's the kind of the infrastructure bit. But at the Newcastle end, there's a fort called Arbea, which is South Shields, where there seems to be a massive supply depot. It's intrinsically connected to the coast.
Well, let's go back to Richborough now. Let's return to Richborough. Towards the end of the Roman period, this was still obviously a vitally important location. So what does this tell us about the coastline's role in the final days of Roman Britain?
So Richborough is occupied and militarised right up until the end of Roman Britain, which occurs roughly in about 410. And we have some very good evidence for that as well.
Yeah, when it comes to Richborough, coins actually can tell an incredible story. And I told you about numbers of objects for Richborough earlier. We've got 56,000 coins.
Well, that knocks the brooches into a cocked hat, doesn't it?
Yeah. And what makes this collection of coinage particularly interesting and unusual is the fact that of that 56,000, around 40%, actually just over 40%, is very, very late. It's Theodosian coinage. It's like 388 through 402 is the period of Theodosian.
Because also, it's easy to forget just how long a period of time this is, isn't it? Yeah. This isn't a couple of decades. This is
The Romans are there for 4 centuries. Yeah. It goes on for a while. So this distribution of coinage is incredibly unusual for a site. If anybody is interested in Roman coinage, there is a lovely graph that exists for the country in terms of how many coins of different periods you expect to see on a site. And you will, if you look at that, you will look underneath it and you'll see a little line that says, except for Richborough. Richborough is taken out of that data because
it's an anomaly.
It shifts the data to the amount of really late coins at that site and the quantity of coins involved means that the one site totally changes the balance for the entire country. So that tells us something.
Yeah.
Particularly bearing in mind that the vast majority of those later coins seem to have been in hoards, that is, groups of coins that were buried together, and all of them were found inside the walls of the fort. But at that point, They are hiding their coinage, they are hiding it in large quantities, and they're hiding it within a defensive structure. So that is telling you very strongly something about how different what is happening there is to other places. And the way in which the coinage changes and the way in which it's deposited speaks directly to that fact that it's effectively the last staging point where defence is going on.
The coinage is so important to the story of the end of Roman Britain. So the Romans don't leave Britain as such. There's not a sort of a mass exodus.
They didn't all pack up together.
Yeah, exactly. Because most of the people living in Britain are sort of Romano-British. This is their home. Yes, okay, there's probably groups of soldiers that get sporadically withdrawn from the garrison, but the disconnect that occurs is essentially that the empire stops paying the garrisons and stops giving them that financial aid, and that essentially ends that relationship. So the tracing the story of the coinage is really important into understanding exactly how that process occurs and exactly when that process occurs.
Now, obviously, you've both alluded to the fact that we tend to oversimplify when we think about trade routes and travel in Roman Britain. We tend to just think about roads, and we've explored the significance of the rivers, the estuaries, the coastlines. What other ways do the coastlines reintroduce some nuance or ways to revisit this period of history?
I would say the thing that the coastline specifically brings to Roman Britain, but probably actually the rest of periods as well, is when we think of Britain, we tend to think of the green bit and then the water is kind of dead space. There's nothing there.
So true.
But actually, when you start thinking about, say, the Saxon shore forts as a complex, they're not linked by the land, they're linked by the sea. And when you place the sea back onto that map as a physical location with lines on it that are movement lines, it changes your conception of how close places are, of how places might link to one another. And it helps us sort of break some of the assumptions that we have in terms of putting our modern understanding of travel and distance and locations onto the past. We need to think about that not in terms of the way we do, but in terms of how much faster travel is in other ways. It breaks our mental map slightly.
So to give you a good example of this, one of the pieces of presentation that we have within the gallery at Richborough is an interactive game where you have to trade goods from place to place within the Roman Empire. And without exception, the quickest way to get there is by sea. So if you were going to go from Richborough to Hadrian's Wall, okay, if you're going to do that today, you'd maybe get off the car ferry at Dover, you'd drive to London and you'd go up the M1 and eventually you'd get to Newcastle, or maybe you'd go to London, you get a plane, you go to Newcastle. In the Roman times, you'd arrive at Richborough, you get on another boat and you go up the coast of England, and you go from point to point to point to point until you got to the Tyne. So it's a completely different way of conceiving of the journey.
But it also just emphasises the difference in the coastline, because you wouldn't go up the modern coastline from Richborough, you'd go through the Wonsom Channel.
This is a really lovely point to end on, I think, because as you say, this is a shifting, changing coastline and continues to be. Okay, obviously our coastline is changing and is going to continue to change at different rates and in unpredictable ways, particularly as we see climate change, etc. What ways are some of our sites threatened potentially by the shifting coastline, and what are the challenges that we have in conservation or as historians in engaging with these sites on the coast as our coastline shifts and changes?
Well, just sticking with some of the sites that we've mentioned already, Richborough, as we said, is no longer on the coast.
Yep.
Similarly, Pevensey is no longer on the coast. Portchester, actually, the coastline there hasn't changed at all. Like, it literally goes around the edge of the castle. It's perfect. Nothing has gone on there at all. But by contrast, Reculver, half of it's now in the sea. So it very much depends on which bit of coastline you're on. And somewhere like Reculver, where we've got this active erosion taking place, something that we have to be aware of is the fact that archaeology gets lost, archaeology comes out the ground, and that can be particularly upsetting in places where, as Reculver, there are graveyards on the site. So there are times when human remains are what's coming out the ground, and that's something that we have to think about in terms of respect and in terms of our potential visitors. So those changes can present very different sets of challenges depending on what's going on.
Absolutely. And also brings us back to the fact that, it doesn't matter whether we're looking at castles, forts, graveyards, something that feels static or fixed or distant in both, time and space. At one point were people's lives and they're our ancestry. And, it's important to remember that these are people's lives. These are communities as well. And I think that's a really nice point to end on. A big thank you to Andrew and Kathryn for joining me. This was the first in our special video series on our coastline. Keep a lookout for new episodes dropping soon on your regular podcast feed, with video available on Spotify and the English Heritage YouTube channel. Next week, we shift to another story of people and movement in our history, this time to the medieval period, and the English heritage sites that offered shelter, employment, and protection to refugees in the past. Follow, review, and join us next time.